the faculty as well as the local community. And in doing so, we encourage you to think more about coordinated community response that could be used in campus setting as well as community setting as a really collaborative way of making change. And through our technical assistance and resource, we've traditionally served as a clearinghouse of resources around evidence-informed, evidence-based programming, both in prevention and in intervention, and we are able to offer that help. So on to the next slide. Some of the key areas that our technical assistance really focuses on include intervention broadly, and that informs looking at advanced trauma-focused work, forensic exam, law enforcement, and working with the different systems. In prevention, looking at evidence-informed model. What are some of the curricula that we could look at, or what are some of the ways we could think of prevention, like talking about consent, bystander, engaging different allies, including men. So we want to kind of look at all of those different pieces with you, but at the same time, we want to make sure that the technical assistance that we provide are meaningful to the work you are doing, which brings us to the enough is enough requirement and the requirement that the campuses as well as our rape crisis partners are currently working to kind of implement in their communities. So both NYSCASA and the Alliance would work collaboratively with the rape crisis programs and provide the rape crisis programs the support that they need to create more buy-in, understand the campus needs, to kind of think of and design programs that are meaningful to the campus, and also secure MOU. What do you need to think of when you're thinking of an MOU? So all those nitty-gritty and the details of the work that involves as you approach and work and collaborate with your rape crisis, with your campus partners, are pieces that we are here to support you more on. So on to the next slide. Thank you, Michelle. So we wanted to keep it pretty brief just for the sake of our time today, but please know that if you have more questions around the kind of topics or issues or areas you need, we could offer you technical assistance on, you could reach Chris Ballerino as well as Michelle Carroll, both at New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault. You could also reach myself, Shashati, here at the New York City Alliance Against Sexual Assault. And both of us, we have traditionally, the NYSCASA and the Alliance have really worked collaboratively across the state at different regions, tackling different topics, and we have a really well worked out method of working together. So if you reach out to one or the other, we'll figure out a way to support you in the best possible manner. So I'll encourage you to reach out to us with more questions as you work with your campus community or your neighborhood or community setting, okay? Thank you so much, Michelle.
Thank you, Shashati. Okay, so now I'm going to turn over the webinar to Joe Storch, who is going to discuss the history of Enough is Enough and unpacking compliance. Joe, can you hear me?
I can, thank you. Okay, if we want to just hit the next slide. So a couple of things. Just to start out, an apology in advance. I am actually home with my little one on parental leave, so you might hear, like now, a little bit of crying in the background, and she's supposed to be napping. So I apologize in advance for any of that. But it is an honor to be here with the Alliance and with NYSCASA. I've been lucky to work with Mary and Joanne and their teams, as well as Caitlin, out in Buffalo for a number of years now, and I have such a huge respect for the organizations that are on here that I couldn't turn down the request to be with you and talk about some of the work we do. And so thank you for having me, and I apologize again if we have any screaming. And so we have some shared objectives, and I think in a lot of communities it's acknowledged that these objectives are shared between colleges and community organizations. We don't want to be in the business of being great responders to sexual and interpersonal violence. We want to have less and then no violence to respond to. And that is something that our community organizations and our SUNY colleges, and I'm sure, I don't speak for them, but the private colleges share as well. I know they have been putting a tremendous amount of resources into this cause as well. So we want to make sure that we respond appropriately, but we really want to work together to change the culture, to end violence and educate our students and community members about what is appropriate for responding. And just so we can go to the next slide. So, when I was in college, I used to do a little work with an organization called Services to Aid Families in Oswego, and I had a tremendous amount of respect for the leadership over there, and they were kind enough to reach out to the college to do some things together. And when I was doing some of the work more recently in sexual and interpersonal violence prevention on college campuses, I thought back to a bumper sticker that we used to give out because we were trying to change the culture around domestic violence. It's not a shame. It's not a personal thing. It's not something that is just within a family. It's a crime. Domestic violence is a crime and needs to be treated that way. And so as we were thinking about the laws that cover sexual and interpersonal violence on college campuses, we decided that we didn't want to have a regime of compliance. We wanted to have a regime where SUNY colleges led. And so that's what led to some of the work that we've done. And so SUNY has spent many years, at least all the time that I've been there and many years before it, working with organizations across the state, across the country, and across higher education in properly responding to sexual and interpersonal violence and working to prevent it where we can. And so we were honored that Governor Cuomo joined the SUNY Board of Trustees for a historic meeting. It is not often that a sitting governor meets with the SUNY Board of Trustees to say that SUNY, which had about 59 or 60 different sexual assault response and prevention policies, should, instead of having 59 very good policies, should have one national model policy. And the governor met with the board chair to his right and some other SUNY folks in the Board of Trustees, and they passed a resolution giving the chancellor, and the chancellor made a working group, 60 days to accomplish this goal. And we had a working group that developed the policies that are on this page, some of which I'm going to talk about in detail, some of which Mary is going to talk about more in detail. But I just want to stress to you that rather than a couple of attorneys in Albany developing this, we went out to the campuses. We had 36 all-stars from around the SUNY community in policing and health education and Title IX coordinators and faculty and students, and then we had 4 outside experts, including Robin Braunstein, who's now retired from Services to Aid Families, Gwen Wright from the Office of the Prevention of Domestic Violence, Libby Post, who is a well-regarded LGBTQ activist, and Laura Dunn, who is a survivors' rights activist and an advocate in the Washington, D.C. area. So we learned a tremendous amount from the partners we had sitting at the table, and just as much we were lucky that the governor's office brought us together with a number of different outside entities, including NYSCASA, the Alliance, and NYSCADIV, and you name it, from around the state of New York, where we were able to get additional feedback, and that feedback was incredibly valuable and led to real meaningful changes within our policies. And so then the governor took the next step. So the policies, we had the Board of Trustees meeting in October. The policies were final December 1st, which is the 60th day. And in January, the governor took the policies and proposed them as legislation for the state of New York. And that you'll see that on the next slide. He called it the Enough is Enough initiative. And it would take the SUNY policies and apply them not just to SUNY, but to SUNY, CUNY, and all of the private and independent colleges and universities. And we were lucky that we were working hand in hand with CUNY the entire time, so our policies and CUNY's policies were very similar. We were also working with a number of private colleges that had very smart, very thoughtful people working on this to make sure that the policies would be the most effective, whether the college is private or public. Those in sort of one sentence on the longest 4 months of my life, we negotiated with the legislature, and they passed unanimously in the Senate and with all but 4 votes in favor in the Assembly, which I don't think is something that happens very often. Democrats and Republicans all voted in favor of it. So it passed. The governor signed it into legislation in July of 2015, and it is effective now. Wanted to talk about some of the specific sections. The one that got the most discussion in the media was, I think it could go the other way, one slide forward, was the affirmative consent policy. And there was a lot of criticism of this policy in the media. It's too complicated. It's 11 sentences. My favorite work was the editorial that was like 40 sentences talking about how complicated 11 sentences were. And students can't possibly understand it, even though it had been developed with students and worked with students. But it has actually held the test of time, and it passed into the legislation with a few changes. And there's a couple of things I want to point out about it. One is that there are 2 ways, there are 2 sort of levels to it. If a person is incapacitated, then they are incapable of giving affirmative consent. If they are incapacitated, now incapacitated is not they've had a drink or 2, but incapacitated is that they cannot make decisions about engaging in sexual activity. And so that is different from having had a drink or 2. But for someone who is not incapacitated, they must affirmatively consent to all elements of sexual activity. Consenting to one thing does not automatically mean consent to everything else. Consenting last Tuesday does not mean that you're consenting today. And it's words or action. So it is something that's mutually understood between the 2 or more individuals that everyone is willingly engaging in this sexual activity. Now, there were some people who were who had negative things to say about it. They made jokes about it, and they said, oh, maybe everybody should, there were politicians who wrote editorials saying everybody should have a notary with them so they can get signed things. And we said that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the type of behavior that we would hopefully all engage in. Before you engage in sexual activity with someone, you would want to make sure that it's something that they want to engage in. So on the next slide, we were encouraged to come up with sort of a one line to describe the affirmative consent policies at SUNY. And so I did that. And here's our one sentence that we explain it. Sex is something that you participate in. It's not something that happens to you. So this is not something that happens to you. It's something you participate in. And if you follow that, then you're following the affirmative consent policy. We had a really, really strong graphic designer who's a health educator at Oneonta who made this among a number of other great resources she's made. Where on the right side it explains the full policy on affirmative consent, and on the left side it explains the plain language, very short 30-second version. What's affirmative consent? It's clear, it's not coerced, it's active, it's the responsibility of the person initiating. It can be withdrawn at any time, and it cannot be given when a person is incapacitated. So that was one of the things we did. And another thing we did was amnesty. Now, SUNY has long had an unwritten amnesty policy. We reached out to all the SUNY colleges and asked, have you ever disciplined someone for reporting sexual or interpersonal violence? And the amnesty is just on the next slide. Have you ever disciplined someone for reporting sexual or interpersonal violence when they've been using drugs or alcohol? And the answer was uniformly no. It had never happened in the history of SUNY. But here's the problem. Almost all our students thought it was happening all the time. So we wanted to make sure that we would educate students that this was not something we cared about. We care about violence and preventing and responding to violence much more than we care about drug or alcohol use. And so it's something obviously that we care about, but we care about preventing and responding to violence more. So we just put it down in plain language. If you are a reporting individual or a bystander reporting in good faith sexual or interpersonal violence, then you will not be charged with a drug or alcohol use violation for use during that same time period. And we really, we're proud of that, and we hope that it's allowing more people to come forward and report. Next, we'll talk about the Bill of Rights, and you're going to hear about it more in a little bit from Mary. But just one beat on it, the Bill of Rights was intended to be a plain language explanation where we would bring together an overall sort of holistic view. The operationalizing of it is in the next slide in the response policy. And that's the heart of the policy. That's where we actually put all these things into operation. But the Bill of Rights is meant to educate people overall in a holistic way about what their rights are. And just the next slide. So, and as I said, this is the heart of the policy. Next slide. I wanted to share with you, and I don't know that we're going to be able to show it, but one of the requirements of Education Law 129B is that colleges or somebody appointed by the college notify and educate students about the differences between the penal law process, the criminal justice process, and the college judicial process. We got together a group of attorneys from Teachers College, from CUNY, Barnard, SUNY, and the University at Albany, and we wrote, and many of them who are former prosecutors and experts in Title IX, et cetera. And we wrote that. You can access it at any time. You could download it. You could remix it. You could do whatever you want with it. The only thing you can't do is you can't sell it. We don't want people downloading it and selling it to colleges and universities. We created it for free. We're giving it away, and hopefully you could find that to be useful. So switching to the next slide. There were a couple of rights, and some of these Mary is going to talk about in more detail, including order of protection and no contact order. The difference between those is explained in that 129B resource on the prior slide. But I wanted to talk about a sentence that was actually written by the governor himself. The governor felt so strongly that there needs to be plain language explanation to the students that the governor put pen to paper and came up with this short Miranda-style warning, and that's something that all students who are reporting sexual or interpersonal violence must receive, that they have the right to report to on-campus or off-campus law enforcement, that they have the right to seek resources from their institution, to not be retaliated against, and to have the rights under 129B. And it's just important to point that out. Moving on to the next slide, just going to talk about a couple of aspects of the response policy, and Mary's going to talk about them in more detail. I wanted you to have them here. We want to make sure that our students have access to resources, whether those resources are on campus or off campus, and whether those resources are private or confidential. And Mary's going to go into a bit more detail on those private and confidential resources, but the idea behind this section is to tell students that not only are there resources available on campus, which we're required to have by law, but there are also resources available in the community, and it should be the victim's choice of what resource to use. We don't want to choose it for them. We want to make sure that there's a menu of available resources, and we will give them the opportunity to choose it. Interim measures. While the process is going on, we want to make sure that we can put in interim measures to hold the state situation constant. And you're going to hear more about that in a little bit. Just wanted to give a beat on it. One of the things that I wanted to mention, and you're going to hear again more about some of these specifically from Mary, but I wanted to mention one very important thing that we put in. Now, those of you who are familiar with the requirements under Title IX guidance from the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights know that there's a requirement that a college continue on with its process regardless of whether there is a contemporaneous criminal justice process. And we thought that that was so important that we wanted to add that into the SUNY policy, and it was the governor's office thought it was important enough that it was added into state law. And that's to make clear that whether or not a victim decides to go to local law enforcement and go through the criminal justice process, the college process must go on, must continue within that process. And so there is an opportunity to pause the college process for a temporary delay at the request of law enforcement, but it has to be justified. So if law enforcement says, we want to set up a controlled call or a controlled text, can you give us the weekend? Can you give us a week? The security person is out of town, whatever. That's reasonable. But if law enforcement says, well, this is, and lucky it's not something that would happen around here, but in other states there have been very notable things, this is a very important football player, we're about to win the national championship, can we just wait until after the season? The answer is that does not justify a longer delay. Having a heavy caseload does not justify a longer delay, but things that could help with the case right now can justify a longer delay. And that is actually in the statute in 129B and was supported at the highest level by the superintendent of state police. I was on a call where he supported that very strongly because he understood and the state police understands that there's two different processes. Not one is better, not one is worse, but they're different, they're separate, and one has to go on and the other has to go on regardless of the path that the other is taking. So moving on, you're going to again hear more about this later, but we thought it was very important to put specific language into the SUNY policy talking about past mental health and past sexual conduct and how it is not relevant to the question of whether there was consent in this specific case. And we all know of a number of cases where somebody will say, well, how can this person say that I had sex with them without consent? They've been going to a psychotherapy, they've been going to counseling, they spent a month here or there, therefore they're liars, and that causes victims and survivors to not want to come forward. And that was something that we felt very strongly we wanted to avoid. And there were also cases where people would say, well, so-and-so had sex with the other members of the football team, so I just figured they would have sex with me as well. And that's, again, not appropriate for the question of whether there was affirmative consent in this specific case. So we didn't think that it was relevant, and we looked through this with a number of attorneys inside and outside and talked about it and said at the end in the policies that, no, these are not appropriate. There are some tiny exceptions that you could find in the New York State Education Department guidance on this. But in the main, it is not appropriate, and so those are not relevant. So any party can prevent the other party from talking about their prior sexual history or prior mental health history. And we felt it was important, and so that's why it actually went in there. Moving on to the next slide. Mary's going to talk about this. Let's move on to the next slide. Confidential reporting, again, it's going to be covered in more detail later, but I wanted to give the overall discussion of it because I wanted to make sure you understand why we put this in. We went and talked to attorneys and we went and talked to experts, and the truth was that it was very hard for people to understand and explain the difference between confidential, private, and privileged. So we said, you know what, let's write it down and let's put it in plain language. And working with students, we developed plain language to talk about what it means if you talk to someone who's confidential, what it means if you talk to someone who's private. If it's confidential, except for child sex abuse or a pending violence, they're going to take it with them to their grave. They're going to keep it with them. They're not going to talk to anyone about it without your consent. Someone who is a private resource, well, they are not going to talk about it openly. They're not going to tweet about it. But what they are going to do is they're going to follow federal law, state law, and the college policy in reporting it. So we wanted people to understand the differences, and that's what the confidential reporting section does. Onboarding and education, I thought, was the most important aspect of the whole policy. Those of you who come to any training that we do at SUNY know that we strongly favor a shift from response to prevention, to pretty robust prevention, and that's something we work on with policymakers in Albany and in Washington. And so we were lucky to be able to put in plain language onboarding and ongoing education requirements that tracked the amendment to the CLEAR Act and the Violence Against Women Act, but importantly, in certain areas went well beyond that. So we say in our policy, and New York State law now follows it, is the only state in the nation to have this, every student athlete must complete the training prior to competing in intercollegiate athletics, and prior to your student club or organization being registered or recognized, being able to get student funding, you have to have all the officers complete the training. Why? Is it because we think they're more likely to be victims? We think they're more likely to be assailants? No, it's because we think they're most likely to be student leaders. And we want to educate our student leaders so they could model positive behavior. And as you look around the campus, it turns out that most of our student leaders are athletes and club and organization leaders. So rather than having a single education session during orientation amidst 5,000 other things that they need to talk about during orientation, we're having continuing programs throughout the year. We're offering it to all our students, new and continuing, and we're requiring that our student leaders have the understanding so they can model positive behavior. And we can do a much better job with your partnership, whether that's at a giant SUNY college, a tiny SUNY college, a private college, a CUNY college. We will do better with our partners in the Rape Crisis Program community, helping us to educate our students. So I hope that you can join us in that. One tiny thing we put into the legislation that I think is important, it got essentially no news coverage at all, is privacy in legal challenges. When a student is found responsible for violating a college policy, and these days they will often sue the college. There's plenty of lawyers who are interested in taking on those cases. What they would often do is they would name the reporting individual. They would name the reporting victim or reporting survivor. And we always said, why? And they would say things back like, well, we need to get their name on the record, or we need to have a complete record, or whatever it is. And we would say, why? And what is the relevance? And the legislature thought that was important enough, and the governor's office thought that was important enough, that New York is now the only state in the nation, it was the first state in the nation, that requires, if you are filing a lawsuit against a college to overturn a finding in one of these cases, the identity of all witnesses other, obviously, if, you could name yourself if you want to as the respondent. You could say, Jones versus whatever college, but all the identities of all witnesses, victims, and et cetera, are considered private, and you would need a waiver authorization from them in order to share that. So we thought that was important, and it made it into the legislation. The one thing I wanted to actively show you was the Saver resource that we created. And Michelle, I think you're able to show the website.
Yes.
Yeah. So you can just pop that up. For those of you who haven't seen this, if you type in response.suny.edu or Saver, savr.suny.edu, and it looks like it's popping up, you'll get the Sexual Assault and Violence Response Resources. And from there, and Michelle, if you can just drop down, just pick a campus, any campus, you can find on-campus and off-campus resources for that campus instantaneously. On campus, and if you click the yellow tab, it'll go to the off-campus resources. And you'll see that the resources are marked. If they're confidential, they have the lock. If they're 24/7, they have the 24. And if they're a legal resource, they have the scales of justice. And if you don't see your resource on here, send me an email. It says on the bottom exactly how to get in touch. And send me an email. We'll make sure we add it. Like you can see there's a legal one. And you'll notice that each of the off-campus resources has a Google Maps link. So if you click that, it'll take you right to it. Now, what you're actually looking at is a computer version of a mobile website, not a mobile version of a computer website. This is designed to be mobile first because we know that violence doesn't always occur when you're sitting at your desktop or laptop computer. Michelle, if you can just go to the top and click on the green off-campus resources, you can see there that you could type in a zip code. If you just want to pick a zip code, any zip code, and click search, now you'll see those resources searched by zip code. You can also search them by where I am when you're looking on the phone. And over to the right of that, if you just pop back up to the top, if you click show on map, that is a map of all the off-campus resources we have in New York State. And that was created, this was crowdsourced with SUNY professionals, but we also worked with NYSCASA, NYSCADIV, OPDV, the Department of Health, RAIN, and a number of other organizations. We took all the different databases that were out there. We combined them into one mega database, and we are making that available to any of your organizations that want to download it. So, Michelle, if you would just go down to the bottom. If you, in your organization, work with a private college and you say, hey, why don't they have that? If you just see on the bottom it says, to bring a similar resource to your campus, there's a resource toolkit. If you could just click on that for a second. This is a doc that gives away exactly how we built this, all the technology on how we built this. And if you go all the way to the bottom, it'll say there'll be a link that will actually give you the entire database. Right there, all the way at the bottom. If you click that link, a copy of the database may be found here. We are making that publicly available, and it can be downloaded by your organization, by a college that you're working with, by a county organization. You want it, you got it. You just have to go and download it. If you need any assistance with that, don't hesitate to reach out. And I think, Michelle, that is all I have, and I could turn it over to back to you at this point.
Okay, thank you. All right. Give me 1 second to get back. Okay, thank you so much, Joe. Actually, Joe, you have a couple more slides. Do you want me to just get them?
I'm sorry about that. And just folks can check out on their own. We've created a similar resource for immigrant and international students, and you could check that out right at that link. You just want to click to the next slide. And SUNY's Got Your Back. I forgot that I wanted to talk about SUNY's Got Your Back. SUNY has endeavored on a university-wide program where we are collecting backpacks, comfort backpacks for rape crisis programs in the communities of the SUNY colleges. Now, we initially intended to collect 2016 backpacks in 2016, but of course the SUNY campuses wouldn't cooperate with that. So we are well over 4,000 backpacks so far pledged or collected in and around the SUNY campuses, and we're going to announce something soon where we're going to even double that. But please reach out to your SUNY college, work with them. We want to make sure that the backpacks are going to appropriate resources that can use them, that can share them with victims and survivors, regardless of whether those victims and survivors are college students. We want to do this to serve the community. We were lucky that the New York State Police got on board really early and have purchased all of the bags, and they were incredibly supportive of this, which allowed us to do far more than we did. But if you go to suny.edu/gotyourback, you can learn about it, make sure that you're able to participate in it, make sure you're able to receive bags to be able to serve victims and survivors in whatever community we have across New York State.
Joe, this is Michelle. I just want to say also to our listeners that if you're interested in receiving these bags, please drop me an email, mcarroll@nyscasa.org, and I'd be happy to orchestrate that for you.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be great, because we're actually, our partners in this program are NYSCASA and NYSCADIV. So getting me that information, we can get it to the right campus, we can get you the bags. And one final slide to talk about, we have in SUNY a webinar series alongside NYSCASA, NYSCADIV, OPDV, and the Department of Health, and we put on webinars about one a month, somewhere between 10 and 14 a year, and some of them are introductory, but most of them are, an introductory overview, but most of them are deep dives with really high-level professionals, and every single one of them is completely free. Every webinar is done twice, so if you're not able to make the first because of a conflict, hopefully you can make the other one. And we do these webinars. We've had folks from the Alliance on. We've had, you name it. And we've been very, very lucky in having really, really cutting-edge, high-level people doing deep dives into their expertise. So hopefully you could join us. Again, it's completely free. And if there's a way that you want to get together with your local SUNY college, you're not on a first-name basis with them, you need some assistance doing that, send me an email. I will get you guys together. We are only going to be able to do a good job if we're working together. And I know in some communities there have been some rivalries or unhappiness between community programs and campuses. And my hope is that in this day and age we can put all of that in the past. If I can help broker a conversation or an introduction, don't hesitate to reach out to me, joseph.storch@suny.edu. We'll get you together and we'll get us working in the right way. So now I think I'm actually done. Thank you so much, Michelle, again, for having me.
Thank you so much for your expertise, Joe, and thank you for that offer of allowing RCPs and advocates to contact you if they're having difficulty making those connections at their local SUNY campus. So now we're going to turn it over to Mary Haviland from the Alliance, who's going to be discussing best practices in reporting, response, and trauma-informed care. And just before I give it over to Mary, I'd like to remind our participants that Mary's going to have a short Q&A after her session because she has to leave us a little early. So if you have questions for Mary, please put them in the chat box and we'll go over them. Additionally, I've noticed a lot of people asking if the PowerPoint will be available. A recording will be available, and so I'll make sure that's sent out tomorrow. So Mary, if you wouldn't mind taking us through the next section.
Thank you, Michelle. This is Mary. And Joe, what a fantastic presentation, chock full of information about Enough is Enough, really from the inside and from the beginning. Extremely helpful to everybody. So I want to thank Joe. I also want to thank NYSCASA and specifically Michelle for arranging or for doing a lot of the logistics around this webinar. It was very helpful. And also Shashwati Sakar from my staff, who's been working behind the scenes to create a meaningful and informative webinar. So I'm going to talk. We can go to the next slide, Michelle. I'm going to talk for a minute about, you can go on to the next slide. I'm going to talk for a minute about the Alliance and some of the work the Alliance does. I know that a lot of people on this webinar are familiar with the Alliance and know that we are engaged in all kinds of policy work. We were engaged on the Enough is Enough legislation. We participated very actively both with the SUNY policy that was reviewed in open meetings on a couple of occasions. We were involved in those meetings. We gave feedback on the Enough is Enough legislation. We also have been very involved in advocating for ample funding for the Rape Crisis Network in the state and have been particularly successful with the help of NYSCASA and a statewide funding working group. Have been particularly successful in the last 3 years in increasing the amount of funds that is going to rape crisis centers statewide. We also, the Alliance is a regional center for prevention in 4 boroughs of New York City, and we have 4 different prevention programs going in that regional center, testing various models, using some evidence-based models and testing others. We're doing some really interesting work around media, nightlife, middle school curricula, and a homegrown program called Project Envision, or I Have the Right. And we also do have a position at the Alliance that is specifically involved with campus, providing technical assistance to campuses statewide. Many of the rape crisis centers in the state do have special funding to do this, and the Alliance is included in that, and very gratefully included in that group. So we are working with 6 campuses in New York City around their response to sexual assault. And we also, as Shashwati talked about earlier in the webinar, we are providing training and technical assistance to rape crisis centers on a whole array of issues, including campus sexual assault, but not excluding other issues around intervention and prevention. And we also we are working very actively on our website. We are revamping the entire website, and soon we'll have a updated website that will be very useful, we hope, to rape crisis centers in the state. So we can move to the next slide. So I'm going to do a little bit of a deep dive into some of the things that Joe talked about. I'm going to try very hard not to repeat his summary, but I wanted to alert those in the audience to some of the requirements of 129 that are helpful, are extremely helpful to survivors of sexual assault. And are helpful to rape crisis centers when advocating for those survivors. So as Joe said, one of the basic requirements of Enough is Enough is a student Bill of Rights. This Bill of Rights pertains particularly to the rights of the reporting student. And there are, as Joe pointed out, there are 10 different aspects to this. I picked out the most important ones. The first one Joe talked about as being kind of the Miranda of campus sexual assault is the right to report to law enforcement. The second one, which has been fundamental to the work of rape crisis centers for probably 3 decades now, is that the reporting student makes the decision about whether to report and whether to participate in adjudication free from institutional pressure. That is extremely important, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. The reporting student must be treated with dignity, and this is a word that the Enough is Enough legislation uses, and receive courteous, fair, and respectful health care and counseling services. I want to point out that a study by SAFER, which looks at campus policies on sexual assault, has found that many students don't look at school policy on sexual assault until they have a report to make. So Joe's comment about the Student Bill of Rights and that Bill of Rights be in plain language and easy to understand should be taken very seriously, because the first time that a student may look at the policy might be when he or she needs to make a report. So that should be taken into consideration. To continue on the Bill of Rights, students must be protected from retaliation. They may be accompanied by an advisor, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later on. They may be accompanied by an advisor throughout the whole process of reporting to a university, from the beginning to the end. They must receive assistance and resources from the institution. Joe talked about that. And interestingly, there is language in the Bill of Rights that the reporting process must be free from suggestion that the reporting student is at fault for the crimes or violations that he or she is reporting. This is an important element to prevent a blaming of the student or questions about questioning about the student's conduct with regard to the report. I believe that the RCPs can play a special role in advocating for this Bill of Rights, that once you're familiar with the bill, that you can help students make sure that they get the things, that the elements of the rights of the Bill of Rights, and hopefully stay on top of the process so that a student receives that to which he or she is entitled. So we can move on to the next slide. Joe talked about the difference between confidential and private assistance. Schools must provide information to its student body about confidential and privileged sources of information and the distinction between the two. And Joe talked about this, that confidential services are those services that are provided in confidence, and the only way that that confidence can be breached or broken is with consent of the client or the patient or the survivor, or if it is believed that that person is a harm to them, may harm themselves or somebody else, or that person is a minor. So those confidential services are extremely important, and there are some on campus, and there are obviously confidential sources of assistance off campus, and those resources should be made clear. And I think we just saw in SUNY's very comprehensive resource list how that could be done. So the private keeping things private by a reporting responsible person on campus basically means that that person has a duty to tell as few people as possible in order to effectively investigate a case and follow up with adjudication within the laws that govern those two processes. So that means that that responsible person can speak to other people who have to be involved in that process, but are not supposed to talk to other people on campus who are not fundamentally involved with the process. So it's important to know, I think, from both the student and the rape crisis perspective, that that responsible campus staff do have a duty to weigh whether they will respect a survivor's wishes as to whether they want to move forward in an adjudication. They have a duty to look at campus safety and at possible harm to other students. And so much in the same way that the district attorney's office does sometimes make a decision to move forward on a complaint made by a complaining witness or by a victim of crime in the interest of the community, the campus responsible staff also have that duty to weigh the report in front of them against potential harm to people on campus. So I want people to be aware that there is a weighing process that may go on when a report is made, and perhaps a student decides that they've made a report and then they decide that they don't want to follow through. That weighing process may take place. So if we move to the next slide, I want to talk about safety for a minute. There are provisions in the Enough is Enough legislation to allow for accommodations. These accommodations can be in housing, employment, academic schedule, transportation, all kinds of ways of making sure that a student might be safe on campus. And of course that would involve talking to campus staff about that issue. But the rape crisis centers have played for the last 3 decades a very important role in making sure that victims are safe after an incident of violation. And so both in the field of domestic violence and sexual assault, safety planning is a very big expertise that the RCPs can be particularly effective in helping students identify what elements of a safety plan will make them feel more comfortable on campus. And just the nature of a campus being a smaller environment, one where people know each other's schedules, are living in close proximity. This is an incredibly important aspect of the response to a report of sexual assault. The other element to this is a no contact order. So no contact orders can be issued by the campus itself. Those contact orders will expire when somebody graduates from college, so they may not be a replacement for a New York State court order, but they are useful in the campus setting. The Enough is Enough legislation requires a prompt review of the need for a no contact order, and it also will allow for prompt review if modifications are needed, if there are safety issues that a survivor is running up against after a no contact order is issued. it explicitly says in the Enough is Enough legislation that it is the responsibility of the accused or the respondent to leave if both parties are in a public place. This is something that we hear from students, has been a problem in the past, and the Enough is Enough legislation addresses that. Also, it may not be well known that arrest is possible in a violation of a no-contact order, and if the local public safety or the campus public safety officers are not empowered to make that arrest, then it can be referred to local law enforcement. There is also a duty to assist with New York State court orders, meaning getting information to survivors or reporting students who may wish that kind of relief. And it's important to note that for the campuses that they should be sure to provide that assistance in an expert manner. That family court orders and going to family court, you need to somebody needs to talk to the reporting student about that from a knowledge of family court or criminal court actions. There is the possibility of suspension if there's a continued threat, despite a no contact order, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the Clery warnings. This is not, this is something that's in conjunction with the Enough is Enough, but Clery does require a timely warning to campus, to the campus of crimes that are listed by Clery, which include sexual assault, and that is required if there could be potential harm or continuing threats to students and employees of that campus. And sometimes those Clery warnings are made without the reporting student understanding that that's going to be made, but it also can alert the respondent or the accused that a report has been made. So those warnings would require special safety planning for students, and rape crisis centers might be helpful in helping around that area. So access to services. The next slide, Michelle, thanks. So the law provides that a reporting student have access to a sexual assault forensic exam, either through campus health services or through an MOU with a local healthcare provider. This is the rape crisis centers understand how important this exam could be, and that survivors should have the option of a forensic exam. It is well established in this state that it is the survivor who determines whether they want to have that exam or not, so their consent is required. We are recommending that the campuses utilize local safes, and actually we're working with DOH on making sure that there is a local safe in each county. We've heard that there are problems in some counties with excessive traveling to sexual assault forensic examiners, and so we are hoping to rectify that situation. So the other aspect of the Enough is Enough legislation is that if a campus cannot provide the services that are required of a reporting student, that they're encouraged to enter into an MOU with local service providers. We are suggesting SUNY has a model MOU. We're suggesting that people use that MOU, that the rape crisis centers use that MOU when approaching, when approaching campuses about providing services. It's important to be familiar with the provisions of those MOUs and to be careful that if the campus legal office looks at that MOU and makes changes in that MOU, to be very mindful about what those changes are. there have been MOUs that have been modified that violate the Rape Crisis Center's ability to provide confidential services to reporting students. So some colleges are asking that Rape Crisis Centers provide information to the college about that reporting student that they cannot provide. So just be careful when you are negotiating an MOU. Be mindful of the VAWA regulations regarding provision of services in the community, and the fact that VAWA requires that those services be provided confidentially. So let's go on to the next slide, which is adjudication.
Hi, Mary. It's Michelle. I just wanted to give you an update that you're running a little low on time, so just keep that in mind so you can have some questions for you.
Okay. All right. So how many more minutes would you say, Michelle? I have 2 more slides.
Just give it, like 5 minutes.
Okay. Okay. Perfect. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the adjudication. Joe talked about 2 aspects of this very thoroughly, so I won't go over them. He talked about the fact that adjudication can run concurrently, and he also talked about prior sexual history. So I'm not going to talk about those last 2. Let me just talk about the first one. You have a right to an advisor. The need for support during adjudication is extremely important. I'm sure there are a lot of people on this webinar who can appreciate that. The need for emotional support, safety planning, and even evidence collecting is an important function of somebody who is supporting somebody through adjudication. So not all colleges, my understanding is that not all campuses and colleges allow an attorney to be an advisor, or if they allow the attorney to be an advisor, sometimes they do not allow them to speak on the record. But regardless, it is very important to have that kind of support in advance, and so some projects are finding that even if attorneys are assisting with the adjudication, it's worth that investment to help students get through the process. Also, the team that is adjudicating must be free of conflicts of interest. I think this should be understood. There are obvious conflicts of interest where, a faculty person has contact with a student through a course or as an advisor or some position like that, but there might be subtler kinds of conflicts of interest. For instance, many dean of students are in charge of alumni relationships and are very concerned about the reputation of the school, and therefore that might influence decision making in an adjudication hearing. So some of those kinds of more subtle conflicts of interest should be taken into account, or at least considered by campuses when they're putting together their adjudication team. And finally, I want to talk about some of the due process rights of the accused. The Enough is Enough legislation does provide for due process rights. These are afforded to both parties for the most part in the proceeding. Right to notice, an opportunity to offer evidence, access to full or fair record of the proceeding. One level of appeal is provided for in the Enough is Enough legislation. There is a express language providing presumption that respondents are not responsible until a finding is made. The college has to provide a notice of the sanctions that might be imposed, and finally, the adjudication team must provide written notice to both sides of the final decision and the rationale for the sanction. And that concludes my. Well, no, I have one more. I'm sorry, I have one more. I think that for the Rape Crisis Centers on the webinar, trauma-centered response is central to all of our work. Here are the principles that we've gleaned from our work and also from a working group that's been working on a set of guidance principles for working with campuses. And these are the principles that we've highlighted for trauma-informed care. If anybody wants training or follow-up on that, and actually the Enough is Enough legislation does mention that training should include trauma-informed care. of the campus staff that are handling sexual assault. So if anybody wants a follow-up on that, on possible training or understanding more deeply these principles, they can contact either NYSCASA or the Alliance to get that information. And Michelle, I'll stop there.
All right, thank you, Mary. So we actually have one question for you at this time. There were several other questions, but I'm going to move those to the end.
Okay.
So the one question that I'll give you right now is, does a victim need to proceed with a criminal investigation to get a no-contact order from a university?
So say that again. Does a reporting student have to proceed with a criminal investigation to get a non-contact order?
Yeah, from a campus.
No, those are completely independent processes, just the same as Joe talked about the penal law having a different standard for consent than the campuses have. The no-contact order and the accommodations provisions in the Enough is Enough legislation, that is a process that the campus can fulfill without a report to the local law enforcement.
Okay, thank you, Mary. So now we're going to move into best practices in prevention and taking stock of our work with Shasha T. Shasha T, are you still on?
Yes, Ms. Shell. Can you hear me okay?
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Michelle. So I'm really excited to be here today to be talking about some of the work that the Alliance has been fortunate to offer and collaborate with both with the rape crisis programs here in New York State and most primarily in the downstate neighborhood, but also the work and the collaboration we have been able to forge through our campus partnerships with the campuses downstate. So I wanted to kind of talk about prevention and how do you create your prevention programming using the Enough is Enough legislation as a framework. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit and recognizing that today would only be a start of the conversation, and perhaps we could kind of glean through some of the key takeaways and create a ground for further discussion. I also want to recognize the fact that on our audience today, there is a range of expertise both from the campus and rape crisis side in terms of expertise around developing programs, knowing community. So I want to recognize that level of and the range of expertise present here. So without much ado, I do want to dive into the conversation we have here in front of us. And what I'm going to do in the amount of time we have is really guide us through a process of what are some of the big pieces that we need to be thinking about as we think of a program that on one hand needs to be compliant to the mandates, and on the other hand has to be campus responsive, needs to reach out to the different population on campus, whether that be a small liberal arts campus or that be a big STEM campus that involves or sees a lot of international students, whether you be on a campus that sees a lot of commuter students or residential students. So really want to kind of look at some of the formulas for some of the big pieces that would guide us in, like, what do we need to think about to come up with that prevention programming. So to start that conversation, Joe talked about this in on his piece around, like, looking at the legislation, but I wanted this to be the framework of our conversation around what are some of the things we need to be thinking about and what are some of the pieces that we need to be recognized as we develop the programs. Who are some of the population that the legislation encourages us to think about and look at as we think of some of these programming? To start with that, we know, as Joe previously mentioned, that the Enough is Enough legislation really encourages and requires a comprehensive onboarding program for all new students, including first-year, graduate, undergraduate, professional, as well as transfer students. It also asks for a training for student athletes as well as leaders and officers of registered and recognized student organizations. What we also know from the legislation as well as the guidance document that the SED and the New York State Office of Campus Safety created is that it asks for and encourages ongoing prevention and awareness program that educates and involves and engages the larger campus community in some of these conversations. And those includes your distant and online students that are participating in your program, the international students that are employees. Also critical to remember are the high-risk population in your program. If your program is serving API community, if your campus is seeing a lot of Latino, LGBTQI identified communities, how do you think of a program that really resonates with those different communities? What was also interesting in the legislation is it engages parents of enrolling students in some of the information. So it talks about sharing some of the information via mail or when parents are attending the program, posting some of this information on the website so that the parents know, that the campus has a strong commitment to sexual violence prevention. So with those as like the framework, I want to kind of take a moment and think about what can campuses and rape crisis programs think about as they develop these programs. So one of the key things that stood out to us in talking to some of our campus partners is making sure that these programs are responsive to the different communities on your campus. Oftentimes, as we started working with rape crisis programs and providing technical assistance, one of the pieces of recommendation we always share with our rape crisis partners as they start forging that relationship with the campuses is know your community that you're trying to serve, know the campus that you're approaching. What that looks like from a rape crisis provider side as you're getting ready for that relationship is to get on their website, see who these people are, look at their demographic, who are they serving, what percentage of the population on campus is, let's say, international population, what percentage of population is from the API community, Latino community, undergrad, graduate, female. So really understand the demographic before you approach the campus. And as in that process, what we hope you would be able to develop when you have the first meeting with your campus administrators is really provide to them some programming that are responsive to the community. So, for example, if you are a rape crisis program that is approaching a campus, you need to be thinking about, and that, let's say, the campus serves LGBTQI population, you need to be thinking about a program that really is meant to be inclusive and talking about those experiences. So those are some little tips to kind of think about as you start thinking about a broader program. What it also talks about is that as we think of prevention, it has to be different methods ranging from single, one-time, for example, an onboarding or orientation program to multi-session that could be done throughout the year so that you could increase the dosage or the number of times you're exposing students and your campus community to the messaging that you are holding strong around prevention and best care. Also, we heard our partners talk about the value of campaigns and peer-led activities because we learned from students that you're more likely to listen to a presentation or kind of own it and retain some of this information if it came from one of them who understands, who are going through the same life experience and can relate to some of those information being shared. So on to the next slide. So what we also want to consider as we think through some of these pieces is the content. The Enough is Enough legislation gives us some direction in terms of what content should be minimally included. And as you can see on this slide, some of these content are pretty basic, generic in terms of sexual assault, knowing the impact, long-term and immediate, bystander intervention, how can you be a bystander without kind of putting yourselves in the harm's way, the institution's roles, policies as they touches the students' effects, as well as where to go if you are on campus and you need resources. So those are pretty elementary as well as very foundational information that the campuses are required to provide. However, as the Alliance met with many of our community partners, we learned that community as well as campus partners, we learned that campuses are doing a lot more than just what's asked of them through the Enough is Enough. They're trying to understand their culture. They're trying to understand what the students are going through. Many campuses talked about online dating, and what does that mean? How could you ensure that you are training and educating students about a safe, healthy, positive sexuality when they're thinking about online dating? So what we did was we created a list of topics just from hearing our campus partners in terms of the needs. It included hookup culture, rape culture, where's the fine line between harassment and healthy flirting. Also from a lot of campus administrators, we heard requests for, like, now that we have these campus climate assessment, how do we use some of this data to design our prevention programs? These are really valuable information. We would encourage the campuses to think about their local rape crisis community as those resources, because rape crisis programs have been doing this work for a very long time. They have worked and served in different communities, taken prevention at a time which was pretty new, and have kind of molded and modified prevention so that it makes sense to these different communities. And one of the important topics that we have seen rape crisis programs kind of work through is intersectionality. How do you work with these different communities so that you're not presenting a one-size-fits-all program that does not really resonate with the larger population you're serving? So I would encourage the campuses to kind of think in that broader way in terms of how can we bring the larger community, the rape crisis who've been experts in prevention and community service, how can we bring them into that conversation? On to the next slide. Selecting the right program. So when the Enough is Enough legislation came out and we started meeting some of our campus partners, we heard a lot of them being very anxious about, now we have to create this program that talks about being responsive and creating meaningful program that resonates with the population we are serving, but we don't know what that right program looks like. So much of the time in our earlier spring this year, we spent looking at what would those programs look like. What would a right program look like? What are some of the different models you could consider? A lot of the campus programs told us that they're using a range of online modules, and they asked us, could that be kind of used in conjunction with other programs? So some of the questions that we found helpful in thinking of how to design a program were pretty critical, and we wanted to look at those questions as a formula for how to pick your program. On to the next slide. And I have to apologize because I'm rushing through the information so that Caitlin has a little bit of time to talk about her pieces. And please know that if you have questions about any of these pieces, both Michelle and I are available to have a more focused conversation. I just want to make sure that I cover the broader points and leave a little bit of time for Caitlin to talk about collaborations a little deeper. So going back to the slide, one of the things just from our history of working on prevention, from serving diverse communities, different age group, we found that a formula, a quick and dirty formula to a very effective prevention program is that it has to be comprehensive. That is, your prevention program has to have multiple components to it. So on top of in addition to the orientation and onboarding training you're doing, what else could you do? Could you perhaps do a poster campaign, an awareness session around SAM, engage the peer leaders, the student leaders who've already been trained in some of these activities and see if they could be involved in leading some of these conversations. Also making sure the trainings are interactive. That way you're engaging students in sharing their lived experiences in ways that kind of interface with the message you're trying to share. Timing is critical because your program has to be appropriately timed. We have heard through data and anecdotes that the first semester is a time where we see a relatively higher number of sexual violence and perpetration and victimization experiences. So you really need to think about, could it be possible that when we onboard new students, that could be a time for new and returning students to kind of receive a refresher. I do want to say it with a little bit of caution and recognition of the fact that campuses are already doing quite a bit. So this is where perhaps the rape crisis programs could come in and figure out a plan that this is how my year is going to look like. So working that plan out with the campus that in this academic year, this is how we are going to time our programs, that they are in regular intervals, touches different groups, like students, faculty, administrators, but is also informative and well-rounded. Also, a critical piece in the formula is making sure that as we create these trainings, it also creates opportunities for the people participating in the program to get some of these skills. So in your training, could you provide opportunities for people to learn how to help or support a friend that is going through, experiences of sexual violence, how to handle disclosure as a faculty if a student comes to you, how to kind of step up as a bystander if you hear a friend slip in a rape joke. So really those skills are super helpful. Also, the two critical pieces are really knowing your population, which we talked about, but taking a look at the budget, if you could take us to the next slide. I want to quickly skip to this slide around what else is out there. We know that the online module is a really great way of kind of gaining access and sending the information to a broader population, but we know that there is also other models that programs have access to. And in thinking about some of these curriculum, there are curriculum-based prevention programs, there is social media poster campaigns, and most importantly, there are local homegrown programs. The reason I brought up budget and jumped to this very slide is because some of the CDC recognized promising and effective prevention practices are really expensive for many of our local and private campuses to afford. So really turning to your rape crisis program who may have a trained advocate in some of this curricula could be a perfectly great way to collaborate. Turning to your rape crisis programs to learn more about these homegrown programs, for example, the 22-1, which is a fantastic program launched by SUNY Binghamton, is a great example. This program has sustained itself for more than 10 years now. It was started by Greek programming fraternities, and now it's recognized by NYSCASA and Department of Defense. So it's a great example of how local homegrown programs can go a long way. Michelle, if you could move us to the next slide. Excellent. We talked about some of these barriers around making sure that the program is all-inclusive, and Joe talked about it as how important this is in terms of making sure your program is inclusive, but also it's not top-down, so it's not something we would encourage that as you think of the program, bring in the student leaders. If you're a program that are serving communities of color, you have different communities on campus, LGBTQI, bring in your student leaders who've already been trained. Reach out to your rape crisis programs. Another critical piece that we want to lift is as you think of sexual violence prevention, to avoid conflating sexual violence prevention with prevention of alcohol abuse, because oftentimes that lead to a causal relation to prevent sexual violence and can lead to victim blaming. We talked about the plain language and how important that is, but I also want to conclude the barriers by saying that the one-off trainings during the Sexual Assault Awareness Month, orientation, offering programs in a box that may not resonate with all population could be potential barriers to you doing a really meaningful programs. On to the next slide. Evaluation. I feel like for the sake of time, I just want to summarize the slide by saying that you really want to show the work you're doing. You really want to show that your effort, the hard work, the connections you've built is really making an impact. And for that, evaluation could be meaningful as you plan through the process, as you make modifications, changes. And I would encourage you to work closely with the rape crisis programs who have had experience evaluating their own program I also want to wrap this slide up with a disclaimer that we wanted to give you a flavor of how to think about evaluations. I'm leaving you with this slide and the promise that we would come back to this, and this really deserves a space in the conversation as a webinar itself. On to the next slide, and that really leads to Caitlin's presentation around who could help you with the planning. I feel like definitely your campus offices, women's centers, student, faculty, and community members can. But most importantly, I feel like I've been underscoring it throughout my presentation. Turn to your local rape crisis programs. Forge those relationships, because these are people that have done the work in the community, knows the community, and knows of what may work or not. So the campuses really bring the knowledge and understanding of the community they're serving, and then looking at rape crisis programs as the sexual assault prevention experts who could kind of then come in and tag team with on this work to end sexual assault. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Shashati. Caitlin, this is your turn. And just for all the presenters, please continue sending in your questions. I don't think we're going to have time to go through them today, but I am collecting them. And when we send out these slides as well as the recording, we will also send those questions and the answers as well. So thank you, and continue to send in your questions. Caitlin, it's all you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I know we're to time here, and I just wanted to take a moment to say that in terms of opportunities for collaboration, I'm currently representing 3 rape crises in Western New York that I work with, and we have, if we move to the next slide, over 21 campuses that we work with, and these campuses represent 2- and 4-year colleges, private and public. There's 6 SUNYs mixed in there as well, and we've had either historically existing relationships with some of these campuses or emerging relationships as a result of Enough is Enough. And so from either the Rape Crisis Center side, the community side, or a campus side, I think one of the best things to take a look at, and here's sort of where I will sit with this, is taking stock of who is currently connected either with the Rape Crisis Center if you're on a campus, or from the Rape Crisis Center, who you're currently connected with on your campus. So really take stock of maybe who your prevention educators work with, who are your victim service providers working with, if you have faculty members, who are they currently working with at the Rape Crisis Center, because I think it will allow for the opportunity to really assess how you're currently connected. And then your next step is, if you are emerging, is to think about how do we have these meetings, how do we bring folks together, how do we have these conversations. In my next slide here, and certainly all this will be available in sort of the resources that we're sending on here, is that there's multiple ways to execute all the different prevention and direct service options that were already discussed throughout the webinar. And so what I just wanted to do is give you sort of 3 nitty-gritty sort of concepts around that. You can sort of work piecemeal, one-to-one, who do you already know. You can think about bringing together task force or committees, and some of our rape crisis centers do just that. We either convene our colleges, or our colleges already convene, and we sit on those. And then really it's taking stock and sort of thinking about how do we execute this. And Michelle, if you wanted to move to the next slide, how do we execute this so that it exists beyond just this point in time? And so thinking about really who has the capacity to do this work, where is that going to live, and then how can we build into an MOU or a relationship that exists outside just the current people that are working on this. And so there are going to be campuses that have the capacity to do a lot of the prevention education programming, and there will be campuses that don't. Our rape crisis providers have done this work for decades and are both victim service providers as well as prevention educators. And so really finding a synergistic relationship that works for your campus and your community at the same time is going to be really important. And some of that is literally just sitting down and doing those initial meetings. What are our intentions? What are we really good at? How can we work together? And starting to really build and define those roles. Who is going to do what? And some of that can be through the initial key stakeholder meetings. Some of that can be through sort of a more grassroots effort. But as you work towards sustainability or encapsulating into a memorandum of understanding, that's a really good way to move that forward. And location. Some of it will be, and I think this is slated for a future webinar around having campus-based advocates and having rape crisis program advocates housed on campuses, and thinking about how do you build that, if that's something that the Rape Crisis Center or the campus wants, and then literally how do we move this along. And so some of it will be those initial meetings, some of it will be converging task force and coalitions, and some of it will really be potentially in the future for some places having co-located staff members on campus communities that are rape crisis services employees. So there's a variety of options in both prevention and response, much of which has already been discussed throughout the last hour and a half here. And that's really, my next few slides just sort of give key pieces all in summary about what could some of those services or prevention education be. Rape Crisis Center staff, many throughout the state, have already been trained in a lot of prevention education programming, including a green dot or bringing in the bystanders. So there's opportunities, if you are looking, like Shashti had said, to put in existing programs. And they can also work side by side with you to build out homegrown programs and then look at evaluations. Because the end goal for all of us, whether we're campus or community-based, is preventing and ending violence and making sure survivors and victims have safe and healthy pathways to get to their next steps. So we're really looking at sort of the long haul of culture change, and there's lots of opportunities to do that. And my next two slides, and Michelle, we can certainly skip ahead right to your closeout here, but these are just opportunities to folks, as you'll see them when you get the resources, are just some potential opportunities to have built into your MOUs. So thinking about who will do what and when, and really those meetings and having those hash out meetings and bringing together the ground folks and then higher up administration as needed. And then as you work your way towards this MOU, these can be components that you can build in and say, this is what the Rape Crisis Center will be responsible for, this is what campus staff is responsible for, and it will look different for probably each and every campus. And so I think, Michelle, that's probably a good point to hand it back over to you, because these are just, for the sake of time, opportunities that can be worked into collaborative partnerships. And I'm certainly available, as are the 3 Rape Crisis Centers that I work side by side with, to talk a little bit more in detail. If folks are interested, please feel free to contact me.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Caitlin. And I love your idea about future webinars on how to bring Rape Crisis Center advocates onto campuses. There will definitely be follow-up webinars to the information that has been discussed here. And I want to thank all of our presenters again for their work. And really, it's my own fault for choosing presenters who could easily have several hour-long webinars and trainings on their topics. So thank you, everyone, for sticking with us this long. As I mentioned previously, I will send out the recording as well as the slides, as well as the questions and answers that I've received during this PowerPoint tomorrow afternoon to everyone that has registered. So you will get all of those resources, and we'll have time to review them at your leisure. And I'll also send the contact information for myself, as well as all of the presenters on this webinar, so that you can contact them and continue this conversation. Just before we end, I'd like to make sure that everyone is aware that that they can join the New York State Campus Consent Consortium by simply emailing myself. And when you join, you'll be able to get information on all of the webinars that we do in conjunction with NYSCASA as well as the Alliance. It is free to join, so there is no reason not to email me to get on that email list. And again, I want to thank everyone for their time, and you will receive follow-up resources, contacts, tomorrow afternoon. So thank you, and have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.